Okay, let's get started. My name is Ferran Sala. I'm one of the vice presidents of the Global Legal Tech Hub. The Global Legal Tech Hub team, I want to thank you all for your attendance, especially to our panelists today. And I have to say that today is a special event for me as a part of the Global Legal Tech Hub and a part of the vLex crew. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Robin Chesterman, the Global Head Product of vLex, who is going to lead the talk. Rob, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
just
so
a little bit of administration. Colin is actually the moderator, but I'm happy to be introduced.
Okay, so Colin, nice to see you again. So I remind you that if you have any questions for the speakers, you can use the chat, and at the end of the table we have some time for it. Okay, so with no other ado, so Colin or Rob.
Okay, thank you, Ferran, and thank you very much, Ferran, and thanks everyone for joining us. And I'm also grateful to Robin for pulling together this wonderful group. It's my honor to participate as your moderator. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada. My name is Colin Lachance. I've worked in legal information and tech for a little over a decade, primarily in publishing, but also in different avenues of legal innovation. My current activity right now is as executive director of the Legal Innovation Data Institute. And what we do there sort of builds on my background. Prior to working in legal data and innovation, I worked in telecommunications as a lawyer and a marketing director. And in the telecommunications industry, everything is interconnected, everything is unbundled. In order for something to build and develop and grow, it needs access to something else. So what we seek to do with the Legal Innovation Data Institute is bring data to the organizations that have the ability to do something with it. So we're a nonprofit, and we have research partners that include different university labs focusing either on legal data science, natural language processing, or other areas, conflict resolution, as an example. We also have members that come from publishing. vLex is a proud member of the Legal Innovation Data Institute, as are other publishers and different technology companies. And so, I mean, ultimately, what we seek to do is help advance the development of AI in law from the perspective of those who have something to contribute. So that's my background, but you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to our wonderful participants. So I'm going to ask each of them to do a brief introduction. We just had a little call in advance, so I know they're capable of telling you that little snippet of who they are. Jacqueline Schaefer, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I am the founder and CEO of ClearBrief, which is a legal tech startup. We started right before the pandemic. And basically, we're a platform that attorneys and judges, paralegals, everyone in the legal ecosystem uses to analyze their writing, right, in Microsoft Word, and pull in and kind of find that needle in the haystack from all the discovery to support your arguments, and also give you feedback on, like, for example, when opposing counsel is not accurately, summarizing the facts. And it does a number of other cool things, including, building an interactive filing so that the courts, opposing counsel, and others can actually understand and see every source that you're citing. And I also, had a career. Most of my career has been in litigation. I started in big law at Paul Weiss in New York, but spent most of my career in public service as an assistant attorney general, briefing and arguing cases all the time before state appellate courts. And relevant, I think, to this panel, I wrote a law review article called Harnessing AI for Struggling Families that came out last year. And it really delved into how AI will transform government social services and courts for the benefit, hopefully, of the public.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm going to move to Alex Smith now. So Jacqueline comes from the perspective of creating practical solutions for organizations that work with legal data. In many respects, so does Alex. So Alex, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi there. My name's Alex Smith. I'm the global iManage AI lead now. My background, I have been in legal for about 20 years now. So I had the publishing background for about 17 years at Lexis, trying to solve many of the, kind of the problems of data and what was in legal research, and then latterly onto practical law content as well. And then spent about 2 years after that at Reed Smith as innovation manager, trying to look at this from the other angle of actually being in a law firm, trying to solve some of the problems that were coming out of AI and transformation that's been happening. But of the last couple of years, I've now been at iManage, and I kind of look at run the product side of iManage around discovery of information within the document management system. So kind of where all the documents are for litigation, transactional, regulatory matters. And trying to pull out knowledge from those. So how do we make that knowledge work for lawyers, looking at, precedent, past work, who've worked on what, etc. And as part of that, we will probably get into later a bit of a definition on what is AI, but I cover things from the search side to the extraction side, trying to make and structuring side of data, and using any technique. I'm not proud about what technique I use to make the right outcome, but any technique is necessary. So ultimately, that's kind of where I work, and trying to work on the actual kind of very unstructured data, which is work product for lawyers.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to pick up on the word technique, and as I move over to Megan Ma. Megan comes to us from academia, and is approaching legal AI from a slightly different perspective than the commercial approach. Megan, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Megan. I'm on the tail end of my PhD, which looked into sort of law and language, and specifically that the law has always been written in natural language, and what are the implications when we have to write and draft the law in a different language, and specifically a programming language, for example. So what does it mean to write law in code? And so sort of pertinent to this panel, I kind of look at my perspective, I guess, on natural language processing. What are the implications of using computational linguistics when we've always used core linguistics? So that's a little bit about me. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Megan. Looking forward to your contributions as well here. Closing off with Robin, who you briefly met, but you'll meet again as the head of product for vLex globally. Robin, tell us a little bit about your work in legal AI.
Yeah, so thanks. I'm head of product at vLex, and at vLex, our bread and butter is legal research. So we're pulling in all kinds of content that's case law and legislation, and secondary sources like journal articles and legal books from jurisdictions all over the world, and we put it all on our platform. And as well as the content, we build technology tools on top of that to help you kind of understand and navigate complex legal materials. So we do like some visualization tools, we do search tools, and we do some AI deep learning based recommendation tools, trying to advise you on how to direct your legal research based on semantic similarity. And as head of product, I'm responsible for figuring out what we're going to build in a way that will be useful for our users in as many different jurisdictions and markets as possible.
Thank you, Robin. And so, as you can tell from this group, we have a group of people who, let's call them bullish but practical on AI. There's obviously some appreciation for its capabilities, but also a good understanding of its limitations. And so, rather than treat this as a negative, I'm actually going to frame this first question in the positive. So we have a question to the panel, and I'm going to ask Alex to start about the biggest misconceptions around AI and legal tech today. Like I said, it sounds like a negative question, but frankly, since we all work in this, and many of the people in the audience work in legal AI, an open and frank discussion around the misconceptions is good among the people who are trying to plow forward nonetheless. So Alex, over to you.
So I'd start this. There's a quite interesting quote that I often use, which is it's something like machine learning is created in Python and AI is created in PowerPoint. And actually it's quite an interesting one, because ultimately, you know, what we're all trying to do is problem solve, you know, and increasingly in an industry which is very data unstructured. Like a lot of the data is in Word documents, it's in text, it's in sentences, it's in different languages and different approaches. Like people write things in entirely different ways. And what we're trying to do is problem solve. And we're trying to problem solve using a toolkit. And I think what's interesting is that, you know, if someone says AI, they disappear often quite quickly into machine learning. It has to be machine learning. The only way we can do this is machine learning. And you go, actually, there's a whole load of techniques. And then someone will turn around to you and you'll talk about graph databasing and how to connect data together, or clean up data. Like, you know, a lot of what AI is being used for at the moment in legal is cleaning up and extracting things out of unstructured data. So I just see it as a toolkit and you're just trying to solve problems. And I have no pride in, you know, do I use machine learning for it? If it's the best tool, fine. If not, I'll use graph databasing. If not, I'll use natural language processing. If not, I'm going to use, you know, named entity recognition. They are all a toolkit that I would say is becoming increasingly easier to use, which is the positive, right? Because of the computing power. So a lot of the stuff that I've been involved in and tried to do, you know, from 2000 onwards, some of the stuff hasn't changed, but what we have is a lot more computing power to try lots of different techniques at these things. So I think that's the exciting thing, is suddenly a project that used to take 6 months to run all the data through now can take 6 minutes to run the data through. Then we can realize it's the wrong technique, and then we can try another technique. And so I think that's the exciting part of this now, is we can try lots of different techniques, but I think we shouldn't get stuck in, you know, saying that all AI is only machine learning. You use the best technique of multiple techniques to try and solve the problems. And often when you come at it from a product angle, you'll end up using multiple techniques behind your product. And it isn't about going, I have AI. It's about, I solve the problem with sustainable, explainable machinery.
Thank you, Alex. And before I move to others on the panel to pick up on the same question, I want to dig into one element of what you described there. Is it fair to say that there's probably been greater advances on legal AI behind the scenes than in front? That the application of computing power and different techniques, the ability, so that the real heavy lifting of AI is actually happening writ large, but it's mostly the work we're doing in the background.
I'd say there's a lot of R&D that sits in some really interesting places, you know, kind of organizations, you know, that I represented here have done a lot of R&D on things which aren't yet ready. Or aren't yet perfect, or aren't yet in products. I could look back on, you know, what were the Lexis labs that I used to interact with 10 years ago. There is some amazing stuff in there that's never made it out to product. And what's probably exciting now is the cost of production's lower, and you can pick things up from Amazon, etc. There are a load of issues about, do you really understand what you're picking up and what you're programming, and the black box, which I think we'll come on to later. Yes. But we now have a faster R&D piece. But I would say that you're right, there is a lot of knowledge which is in academic papers, is in 30 years of AI papers, which we're only starting to get to a product or something which can be actually delivered, because you can clean up the data now in 2 days. You don't have to clean up the data in 2 years, because the 2-year data cleanup never got past the business case, whereas the 2-day data cleanup has a chance to get past the business case.
Excellent. On the misconception question, I want to move over to Jacqueline on this. So in terms of the product that you're bringing to market, it does have the aura of magic to it. So I imagine there's great potential for misconceptions. What are some of the things that you hear when you're talking with attorneys and lawyers about their expectations, and how do you address the misconceptions?
Yeah, great question. So I think the biggest misconception in general is that, you know, AI is going to solve all of our problems. And it's really actually more about, the foundation has to be a really strong, intuitive SaaS product. It just has to be like a classic SaaS product that works really well, that makes sense to lawyers, that isn't totally disrupting their normal workflow. And then you can layer in AI in the places where it makes sense and where it's actually going to add value. Because as Alex was saying, like a lot of it is just not to the point where it's really useful yet. So in building ClearBrief, I really wanted to leverage what I think AI is currently best at, which is kind of like spotting patterns and natural language processing, right? That's kind of the subset of AI that ClearBrief is focused on. And we have an amazing team of NLP scientists that have really helped get us where we are. So the way that ClearBrief works is that, you know, it's built right into Microsoft Word. So it's using kind of what the existing platform that lawyers are really comfortable with. It's kind of our safe place is Microsoft Word, as well as courts, by the way. Like courts all kind of universally write their opinions in Microsoft Word. And so just layering it in there and being really strategic about the SAS framework has allowed us to then apply AI to kind of pull in the most relevant documents, to parse, you know, what the lawyer has written, to figure out, you know, which things are citations, which, you know, how do we highlight this so that they can use their human understanding to improve their writing and improve the brief. So like, for example, I think there's a lot of general research now about AI and how its highest and best use seems to be in augmenting human decision-making. So by simply pulling up the evidence quickly for people, that alone that's not AI, that's, you know, that's a SaaS feature, right? And helping them make that decision about what's relevant and what's the best source of evidence, that's super helpful. And then we can layer in AI that learns from those choices.
Right. Yeah, well, that's excellent. And I think we're going to be picking up on some of those same comments when we talk about explainability and black box activities. But each of you have had the opportunity to mention the learning and the development and the academic work. So it's a natural segue back to Megan to talk about the misconceptions that you may have encountered through your academic research, either as you've carried it out or as you've presented it.
Yeah, so I really liked actually, Colin, how you mentioned AI as magic sometimes. And I think there's a really common article that some of you may have read, which is about AI as fairy dust. And I think that that's really, really quite relevant in this discussion. And for me, at least, particularly from the perspective of natural language, I see that there's a lot about AI sort of at the level of very systemic level. And what Alex and both Jacqueline were sort of alluding to is that we need to get more granular. And for me, the level of granularity that needs to happen is a better understanding of natural language in itself. How humans have used natural language, there's a lot of actually fictional and metaphorical language that we like to use, especially in legal language. And this sort of thick quality, which some people have alluded to, is kind of not possible at the moment with programming languages. And what we've seen is a largely sort of functional perspective on how programming languages are used. And until we get to the point in time where we can play around with coding in a more aesthetic way, I think they're still miles away. And I think the limitation is that don't be fooled by the magic, because at the end of the day, the kind of limit of the technology right now is sort of a toddler learning language for the first time and kind of absorbing that. So until we're able to kind of master a language and get to the point of this aesthetic, metaphorical, fictional language, there's still quite a way to go.
Okay, excellent, thanks. And then Robin, I'm going to ask you to pick up on some of those themes around misconceptions, but also roll that into the next question on educating people about the kinds of jobs that machine learning technology is suited for. Because I think from your perspective as a product lead, you have to deal with both ends simultaneously. You have to recognize that from a marketing perspective, we want to almost foster those misconceptions because that's what brings the customers to the table. But from the development perspective, you have to deal with the education and the hard choices. So I'm going to ask you to speak to both the misconceptions and how do we educate people at the same time.
Yeah, I think just to follow on from what Megan said about a toddler learning the language for the first time, I think that's probably a fair description of where we are at the moment. And one of the misconceptions, maybe not the largest, a big misconception that I think is there is just the kind of shared expectation of what we think the machine learning models are doing when they're doing some of the very impressive things that we see in software today. So it's I think maybe it's around what we think is the level of understanding of the machine when it comes to language. So you can make some really powerful and really useful tools using machine learning. And indeed, I think most or many of the people on this call do that. We do things that can make very accurate recommendations based reading a document and recommending similar things, or grouping things together and finding patterns and stuff like that. But what maybe isn't obvious to a lot of people is how good that system can be without actually understanding, let's say, a lot of the language, the argumentation in the language, or modeling that argumentation in a computer, or you can get very far by approximating these things and finding similarity, but the computer actually doesn't understand what is being said. I think that's maybe important when a lot of people are scared about AI. They think that it might replace their job as a lawyer. We get told this quite often. We're going to have robot lawyers answering questions, but question answering accurately is really, really hard. We're a very, very long way away from being able to give proper legal advice from a computer. We can do some things very well, but we're actually miles away from doing that more complex thing.
Yeah, it's last week, there was a major research paper from the Legal Education Foundation in the UK talking about access to court information, and it's for multiple uses. And in their launch video, they had someone speaking specifically around the question about, well, what can you actually accomplish from a predictive analytics perspective, which is where a lot of people immediately go when you say, well, what's the robot lawyer going to do? It's going to predict something. And a professor from the Cyber Justice Lab in Montreal said that he's been advised by leading AI experts that there just simply isn't enough legal information from any given court on any given subject to really sort of achieve reliable predictive capabilities. And that same Cyber Justice Lab just this past week released a tool that focuses solely on landlord-tenant disputes, and narrowly within there on residential, and narrowly within that primarily on like bed bugs and other annoyance issues, largely because that was what was achievable with the data. There's the models have potential to go further, but if you wanted to apply something approaching understanding, it just simply wasn't enough information immediately to go. So it goes to Robin, to what you were saying, that it's the approximation of what you can achieve using the various other models. And so I want to pick up on that, and Robin, please continue if you have something else to add. But again, it goes to this idea of the education component. Where should we be looking to learn more about this when we can't rely exclusively on the marketers?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one, but I was just going to jump in and say that one of the problems is that the data isn't just in the legal data. The data is everywhere else. It's the real world background knowledge that the machine would need to have about the world to be able to answer those questions. So you're talking about landlord and tenant disputes and bed bugs. To understand what's going on there, you need to know that a bed bug is a thing and it's a problem that people have and it's an inconvenient. You need to know that landlords own property and people are humans and they live in property for shelter and protection, and they have all of these other things that information, that background sort of world knowledge isn't in the text. That's just something that you have to know to apply the text, and it's something that we're very good at. But computers don't just bring in the knowledge that they happen to have and apply it to the situation. If it's not in the data set, it's not in the data set.
I'll ask anybody in the panel who wants to jump in at this point to pick up this thread.
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in. So what I thought was really interesting about what Robin was mentioning is this kind of background knowledge. When we speak to one another, there's something called implicature, implication, and this is something that cannot be modeled at the moment. When we say sentences, there's kind of all these context clues that point towards an answer, and that's why there's miscommunication all the time. And in the same way, machines don't nearly have the competence to do this sort of guesswork almost, or to make those sort of leaps. And so that's part of goes back to kind of the misconceptions and what is capable for machines, but also why kind of education is so important, and kind of the channels that are needed is in one way kind of more, I don't know if more webinars or anything, but at least I think there's a need for more centralized platforms that communicate, you know, how exactly AI is developing and its progress. And yeah.
I think probably we couldn't get through this. Sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add to that and say, I think that what's been really interesting to see in terms of like just being out there as a startup, when I talk to a lot of investors, the first question I get a lot of times is like, how close are we to having AI make all of our decisions and doing away with judges? And like, I'm like, we are not close to that. Like, I think there's a very interesting like push from Silicon Valley to like do away with human decision making, which I think is you know, kind of just, yeah, picks up on sort of the themes that we're talking about, where there's just a disconnect between what AI is good at and what maybe futurists think would be a good use of AI. But there are real pitfalls that we're already seeing play out in cases. Like I'm thinking of, there's a case a couple years ago in Idaho, here in the US, where basically a number of folks had their disability benefits change overnight, the amount of money that they were getting. And it was because of a black box, you know, algorithm that this state agency was using. But it took going to court, litigating, like it was sort of like, well, the algorithm told us that, you know, that's the amount of your benefits. And it turned out once, like in the course of litigation, they realized, oh, whoops, there was an error with the algorithm. And like, yeah, you should have been getting more money. And I think there's just such a strong trust of technology that might not be totally warranted yet, that we want to kind of think about, you know, in the justice system where we leverage AI.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on from that by saying that one of the big challenges we're going to have up ahead is how good the machine will get at approximating the work of the lawyer, but doing a really bad job of it, but looking almost convincing. I was going to say we were probably not going to get through this hour without mentioning GPT-3 as one of the most famous language models that was released last year, I think, by OpenAI. It was famous for being able to do things like, you know, write a news article. You give it a couple of sentences and it could complete the rest. And when GPT-3 was released, we of course wanted to see how good it was at giving legal advice. So we took a lot of different examples, and one memorable one is we wanted to check what GPT-3 had to say about how a court should determine the respective beneficial property interests that an unmarried couple should have, a cohabiting couple who are unmarried and then they separated. How would the court determine what their beneficial interests in the property were, and how was that to be split? And so we gave it a fragment from a very well-known UK House of Lords property law case, and it began with something like, the court is to determine the splits based on reference to their whole conduct and their prior behavior relative to the property. And we gave this to GPT-3, and GPT-3 came back and said, where it's not possible to ascertain that from their behavior, reference should be made to Section 11 of the Matrimonial Clauses Act 1973. And I read that and I went, wow, that is amazing. But legally, it was absolutely wrong. It wasn't just bad legal advice. It was the opposite of the correct answer. So one of the problems that we'll have is that the AI is so good at sounding convincing when given tasks like that. And we're probably going to see more examples of that, where the answer or the suggestion or the prediction is something that looks like something a human might say, but it's actually just not. It's not the correct thing, which is a problem for law, because we have to. It has to be correct. For something like GPT-3, where one of its talents was writing short articles, and summarization is another example that we might touch on. Using an AI to summarize a long news article into a short snippet might be great for a news app, but it's not acceptable for a law report, which is, say, 10,000 words long, and we need a summarized head note. It's not good enough for that, because it's going to miss something, and it's going to get something wrong. It'll say the wrong thing. And those kind of mistakes are not okay for lawyers.
Right. I'm going to ask Alex to do two things now when I put the mic back to him. One is to comment on anything that he feels like commenting on. But the second is to wrap that up again in the topic of educating people about what can be done. Because again, we have this push-pull. We're all advocates of advancing the frontiers of legal information and tech. So but on the education side and on anything else that you would like to pick up on, please bring us home on this topic.
I think the question is expectation, right? Because if it's unexplained and you basically sell it under the kind of Silicon Valley AI, let's stick AI on, you have to have AI in your startup unless you don't get any funding type approach, which we hear of. There's an amazing article on, I think it's known as, it's a guy who from a startup, and he basically writes why he was forced to put the words AI in his company. And he said there was no AI at all in his company. It's called like, I think it's an article called like something like the phony post-industrial bullshit of AI. It's an amazing article where he explains the pressures he's put under. But the thing is that ultimately it becomes an expectation, right? And so you're either going to get someone taking something and going, this is the only answer. And we've been through this before, Google. Like if you talk to any librarian or legal research person, you know, they spent a decade trying to get lawyers not to use Google because of the first search result syndrome. So whatever Google kind of did with all of its AI, it wasn't called AI at the time because we didn't call it that, but people were really worried about the first result. And ultimately lawyers going onto Google, looking at the first result and saying that's the answer. Whereas they knew if they went into a legal research tool, and we've all been there trying to say, look, you've got to look through all the cases. You've got to try and work out what they actually mean and how they're related and where's the precedent in this. I think that's that's going to be a problem again, or you get disappointment. And we're seeing that now on a disappointment level where everyone said, you can do M&A entirely differently because we'll basically tell you all the information about the M&A. And it turns out that actually the AI is probably picking out 60% of the data points, of which another 10% of those definitely need interpretation, because pulling out the words out of a contract doesn't tell you what they mean. And a lawyer can look at them and go, that's really risky. That's not risky, but the machine is nowhere near yet saying that's a risky clause and a not risky clause. So ultimately what you then get is, you know, people are either going to pick up the tool and go, this is going to save me a million% of my time, and they're disappointed, or they're going to say, well, what does it actually do for me? And that's where you get to go back and spend all your time on adoption of these products by saying, actually, what it does is it finds you a first pass, which is probably what your paralegals are doing currently on a M&A review, but we're nowhere near yet saying whether this factor is risky or not, because we don't have the argumentation. We don't understand the context. We don't understand the context of the actual M&A. We don't understand the risk factors of the person who's buying company A and company B. But it's still saving you an incredible amount of time because you're not having to do that first piece. You can change the way you do your process because you've now got a first pass of the data where you can look at it on a dashboard and go, I think the risk might be here. I'm going to focus my expensive lawyers at that part. But what's horrific is if you go through that as a, you know, we were a startup and now not, and a large organization, is you then have to re-explain that and you have to re-explain what it's doing. And I'm sure a lot of the UIs that we're putting together in products then have to start to explain it. They can't just go, here's the answer, because that's your Google. They're having to go, here's the answer and here's why, and here's what it's connected to, and here's what source it was bringing it from, because you're starting to hit the point of people may just lazily pick something up, or they think the machine is finding the answer. But the likelihood is the UI is showing you the top answer, and there are still another 5 answers underneath that didn't quite meet the score, or weren't over 90% right, and that the one that might be 89% is actually the right answer because of the search situation interpretation. So a lot of this turns back on UI. And when you see people trying to do a chat, you know, chatbot's probably, to me, the worst UI for putting in anything to do with finding information, because it kind of just picks the top result, right? You type something in, AI gives you the top result, and you're like going, but it might not be the right one. What about the one below and the one below that and the other one and the one that was slightly off? And that's where I think we have to be a lot more clear on our UIs and what we're selling is, are we offering the answer or are we offering the top result?
To what Jackie was describing too, or it's, you have to conceive of this as a SaaS product. It has to meet the standards, their expectations of other tools we use in other domains, plus somehow achieve the confidence level that you have in law. So
I think Jacqueline's one is amazing. I think it's a really good answer. It's to do with that one is to do, and there are a load of cases now about IDs, people who got turned down jobs, or people who got turned down jobs because they might have had a prison record, because in America you can get all this data and all these risk aggregators pull things together. What happens if it gets it slightly wrong? What happens if you're the 2% of Alex Smith and it picks the wrong Alex Smith and links that to a prison record that I don't have, and then I don't get a job. That's you. Most people go, yeah, it's 90% accurate, 98% accurate. That's my life. My life was in the 2%, and then it's not explainable. That's where you get your risks. And if your UI is just giving you the answer saying he has a prison record, not he has a prison record, but then there's 3 other records on the system, that's a real problem. And I think, we're jumping to potentially the wrong UIs or the wrong expectations of it, because we're not offering people choices, recommendations, the other results, because we're trying to be clever and do a chatbot or an answer system, or here's my UI doesn't have enough space to add 5 results, so I just put in 1. I'm sure that's the right one.
Right, and because 10 years ago we all read Nudge about decision architecture and how to move somebody, and so some of this is happening deliberately. It's not just a question of making a pretty UI. Some of these designs are being done deliberately in order to move people in a particular direction.
Yeah, and in the SaaS world, and get more engagement, get more views, get more hits, and all that kind of stuff.
If the metric is average minutes of use or monthly
number
average
of pages
users,
viewed, or whatever it might be.
Megan, I want to tie back to you again. You can feel free to pick up on some of the other things, but we've danced around and you've mentioned it as well too. The topic again of really understanding the context of the information that the AI is looking at. Natural language understanding and law is tricky. I want you to talk a little bit more about that, but also approach it from the perspective of something that Alex was getting at, the question. I mean, chatbots aren't good because they force the questions down a defined path, and there's not an interactivity. So the AI machine, as intelligent as it can be to retrieve data, might be quite dense or incapable of understanding the question. So again, in any of your work, your research or things that you've looked at, have you looked at the language of the question and as well as understanding the language of law in natural language understanding?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think I wanted to first tie it back to what Alex was mentioning. And one thing that I wanted to point to was sort of the danger of who actually is the end user. So there's kind of a question right now, is the tool meant for lawyers? And it's something that, was connected back to Robin and what he mentioned about GPT-3. So someone who is sort of anyone who doesn't have legal knowledge, they probably think that the answer they received from GPT-3 was great, and that is the legal answer, and that is the correct answer. And even if it's not a ranking system, like what Alex had mentioned, simply the access to legal knowledge right now, the barrier is so high that any sort of technology right now that is able to kind of pull these strings and have the appearance of providing legal knowledge, if I didn't have legal knowledge, I would sort of grip onto it, because the law is so pervasive in our lives that we do need access to this knowledge. So part of kind of this magic is that it ties very closely with the fact that simply getting access to legal knowledge right now is so difficult. And that turns back to sort of open source and how do you actually obtain case law data and all that. And then sort of circling back to, so what I find first is that there's a danger in the gap of who is actually using it and sort of where is the appearance of kind of knowledge at this point. The second thing about questioning, and this is something I find really interesting because it's discussed a lot when you do interviews and when there are survey questions. And this is sort of like pre-technology. When you kind of interview someone or when you offer a survey, the way that you structure questions is in the same way, kind of pointing to specific answers, or you're trying to pull out answers in a certain way. I think it's the same way when it comes to structuring questions in sort of legal expert systems. So this is not so much AI per se or using machine learning, but kind of the other end with expert systems. Do we kind of have a way of saying certain things? And right now I'm kind of playing around with sort of the data versus how people actually ask questions. So if you're using, say, a whole bunch of court data, the language is going to be largely legalese in a sense. But when you ask questions, and especially how we've been sort of trained to ask questions on Google, it's a lot more colloquial and it's a lot less structured. And in some cases, we don't even use full sentences. So I think that's kind of one of the issues that we will be approaching is how do we actually structure our questions going forward? Do we ask them in the way that we use Google, like we type in random keywords as we're asked, or because we've been sort of trapped in this prison of the keyword search if you use Westlaw or LexisNexis? How do you kind of move out of that? And what is kind of type of technology, and how do you actually appropriately structure so that the context clues are there to point to the right answers? So I don't think I have a direct answer towards it, but I think it goes along with how we've been trained in the recent years with Google, and kind of in general, like in the past, how have we actually structured questions for things like surveys or interviews where we wanted to find certain answers. So
yeah, that's it's true. It's true. And because the public hasn't really been an audience for the law up until technology made it easier for them to do it. When law consisted of information only available in courthouses or legislatures, or even when it became available solely through commercial services and so on, the public still wasn't an audience for law. But now that the public became an audience for law at the same time as they were being trained on Google. And it's
interesting, Colin, the interesting one on that is actually the questions are probably in Google. Because where do you go when you have a legal problem? You're probably going to stick it in Google and say, how do I sell my house? How do I divorce someone, etc. The problem is the answers aren't in Google because they're sitting in, law firm systems, private databases, etc. The fascinating one a while back was that Thomson Reuters, when Practical Law, before it got bought by Thomson Reuters, introduced a service called Q&As, which grew out of their telephone line. And in essence, what they did was publish genericized questions and answers that had been sent in from their subscribers. The hits they got on that were one of the biggest drivers of traffic to Practical Law, because it was hitting on the questions, and the questions were coming in from Google. The fact was there was no data to answer the question was fascinating from a legal perspective. It's all about where's your training set, and,
yes.
and where are those pieces. And I'd say the questions are in Google. I'd say the answers aren't in Google.
The questions are in Google. The questions are on Reddit, and there are projects underway through Stanford and Suffolk University in Boston to use the questions in Reddit to try and figure out how that ties back to legal topics. I've been given the 5-minute warning that we have 5 minutes before we move fully into Q&A. We had a fourth question here about black box, the impact of neural networks and other machine learning techniques, and how the potential for a black box scenario can impact the trustworthiness of the tools. Each of you have had a chance to touch a little bit on some of these things in the answers that you've given again, but I'm going to ask, starting with Jacqueline, to talk specifically about some of the black box concerns that you might have experienced when showing off your product.
Yeah, I don't think we personally haven't had that that issue specifically because of the approach that we've taken, which is also the same approach that I argue for in my law review article, which is that I think AI really shines on reducing the administrative burden of attorneys, legal staff, court systems. And I think that's also in some ways where it's lower stakes, right? It's not like a judge deciding, life or death scenarios, a judge deciding how long someone should stay in prison. This is more along the lines of, how to make the day-to-day less stressful. Like, for example, one of the things that our platform does is instantly, magically creates a table of authorities in a brief, which is something, in the US that requires a lot of manual work still at the very last minute. And just to share kind of some human stories, people are telling me that, and I've experienced this, that, the briefs due at midnight and the whole team is staying up just to kind of tweak and fix the table of authorities. Let AI do that, go to bed. That's where I think AI really shines. But the concerns with black box AI are kind of going back to that, that kind of case that I mentioned where there is this implicit trust of technology. And so judges, for example, if they're told, oh, the AI spit out, this person has a low risk of recidivism, and so you should give them this kind of sentence. They tend to trust, that, and not if they don't understand what factors the AI is relying on, that's problematic. I would say my biggest sort of insight that I would encourage everyone to follow Andrew Ng, who's the founder of Coursera, and he has a really good, I think it's weekly or monthly newsletter, and his whole perspective, I think, has shifted to focus on let's not pay so much attention to the algorithms and tweaking the algorithms. Let's actually focus more on data quality and understanding that what data is going into the model, because everyone should know this, this maxim of garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
So I think that's sort of my guiding light, is like, let's look at what data we're feeding into the systems, and then we may not have to worry so much about black box AI in some ways. So.
Okay, Jacqueline, can you please add a link to the chat to the Andrew Ng information that you mentioned? And I'm going to give Robin the very last word on black box AI, specifically around transformer technology. It's got really strong capabilities, the BERT models and so on. So they're really tempting to use, but they're not explainable yet. Within law, how are we going to manage adoption of these powerful capabilities for something that we can't fully explain?
Yeah, so I guess maybe the golden rule is don't trust it with something that you need to be able to justify the answer. I think the way we're going to get through this, and the way we're going to make AI useful for people, is if we ensure that we kind of frame the technology as tools that assist and elevate the work of the lawyer, rather than trying to replace them or do something that they didn't understand the outcome.
Excellent. It's a great way to end that. So Farhan, I think we hit it exactly at the 5-minute warning. And so in terms of opening it up for questions, people can continue to add them to the chat, or if they have, I'm not sure if you have the ability to let them.
Yeah, perfect, Colin.
So Farhan,
Okay,
maybe we'll ask you to ask the first question.
Thank you, guys. It's been a very interesting talk. As you said, Colin, now is the time for some questions. If someone wants to ask something to our panelists. No, I don't see any questions in the chat. No,
I don't see any either.
We don't have any questions yet. So let's give a couple of minutes.
There's one in the questions and answers, which is, in what way do you think ethical problems will stop AI development?
Well, Alex, go for it.
Yeah, so the question that I can see in the Q&A is, in what way do you think ethical problems will stop AI development?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ethics question, I think there's been a lot of ethics washing to begin with, but I think that it's push is coming to shove now on the question of explainability. And I think that's going to be a big question for a lot of people who have tried to train and use tools they don't quite understand. So I think there's a lot of questions going to be on, how did you use it? What techniques, what tools have you used underneath your product features? But I think following on, the other one will be on, what data did you train this? Because I think that just follows on from the last question, is I really can't stand anyone who goes on and talks about unsupervised machine learning at the moment, because it just doesn't really exist in reality. Everyone is training something on something, especially in tough domains. So I think, the data side is one, and the other one is like, what did you do and can you explain it? And, did you just pick this off the shelf, or did you actually understand what you were doing? And I think that's going to be the fun part of, especially when you're trying to sell this, or you're trying to show research, is what did you actually do and how does it actually work, and show your workings, which I think hasn't been done to date, because there's been this rush for VC money, rush to show an AI feature, rush to have AI in marketing. You are going to have to explain this to inquisitive lawyers, or be unpicked at court, which is going to happen more and more, I think.
Yeah, and I think we are beginning to see that as part of the founders' story of new things, how they're approaching it, because as governments around the world adopt ethical AI policies, or at least discuss them, it becomes part of the conversation well beyond law. And so again, law follows everything else. So we'll get there. A question also in the chat. Is it advisable to use AI in due diligence and M&A? And Alex, I'm actually going to ask you again to take that, given the breadth of your experience and the work that you do at iManage with document management systems.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to the answer I gave, is that it's part of the process. The really painful, I think Jacqueline touched on this as well, the really painful part of a due diligence exercise is, what should I look at? You're looking at a corporate, there's hundreds of thousands of contracts, which ones you look at? And lawyers probably look at some different pools, make choices, decide what to look at. You know, the fun part of the M&A piece is you're going to be able to get a load of data, and you'll be able to see a beautiful spreadsheet with a lot of data where you'll make very good lawyer decisions about what risks you're going to look for. What it's not going to do is tell you whether to buy the company or not. That's still going to be done by a lawyer, looking at risk factors, looking at really risky contracts, looking at certain aspects, and your due diligence advice note will be still written by a lawyer. It won't be written by a machine, I can guarantee you. But what you will do is save a lot of time on finding those risks in the first place, which currently is being done by a lot of triage work, a lot of outsourced tools, a lot of paralegals, etc.
Yeah, I think that comes back to what we were talking about, understanding the context. You can't give an opinion on risk unless you understand the wider context. If you talk to in-house lawyers, often what you hear is an anecdote where they'll say that someone comes up to them and says, "Could you just cast your eye over that contract and tell me if it's okay?" And the answer is, well, it depends enormously on what you're signing up for. Like, what's the outcome that you want? It's the same if you're asking a person or a machine. It depends on what you consider to be acceptable risk, and the machine can't guess that for you.
There was
I think law has a very good precedent is e-discovery, and e-discovery has gone through a lot of this over a decade and a half, and they know where, a lot of their tools are based around triage and humans in the loop. It wasn't called AI, but they have humans in the loop. Here is something, do you want to review it? Okay, and here is the factor, and here's why it's risky. And I think we're just beginning to learn how to use that stuff in transactional space.
I think maybe an answer to the question is that you can use AI, but for due diligence, but do your due diligence on the tool that you use.
Yeah, and work out where your humans are in the loop and where your high risk stuff is that can't be done by a machine. It needs to be done by a lawyer who understands the client, the risk factors, the historic risk, all of those things. Back to your point of, you wouldn't get that from the legal documents on what's the risk of your client and what's their risk rating and what are they afraid of.
Just to put that in really practical terms, like similar to the e-discovery thing, is the thing you do at the outset of e-discovery is the two sides talk about which search terms you're going to use, and that's a really important human decision. And great, the AI could help you make sure you find the documents that have those search terms, but there could be things that are missed. And I think it's really interesting to see like natural language processing in particular, and how that's becoming, the evolution has been really valuable to finding like variations on the search terms, or just, other ways of talking about that issue that might not have showed up before in the search results. So anyway, I think human in the loop, like in a practical term, like a human needs to set the parameters of the search and define what's important.
That's right. That's right. There was a quote, I think it was attributed to Noah Weisberg of Kira that I just read the other day, talking about, again, using AI for due diligence. It's rarely about the number of documents that you want to read, but about how quickly you want to close the deal. So that's what dictates things more, like the things that are important, the risk tolerance, and how quickly you want to get it done. When all those factors combined, I think there's an inevitability to using AI, because otherwise you're not necessarily going to be able to review anything in that same time frame. No new questions have come in. Farhan, I'd like to ask if you have some questions for the panel.
No, I think that we have been discussing a lot, and I think we can spend hours talking about this, but now we have been here for almost an hour, which is the expected time for this webinar. So on my side, there's nothing else to add. I don't know, Colin, if for your side wants to have a final question or not. Otherwise, we will finish this great webinar. I mean, Colin, what do you think?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think we can respect everybody's time, give them exactly the time back that we promised them, and thank everybody on the panel for their wonderful contributions. So
again, thank you all of our panelists for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. And to the rest of the attendees, hope to see you again soon in a new webinar of the Legal Tech Hub. Okay?
Thanks very much.
Okay,
Pleasure
so
to be
thank
here.
you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.